Have you ever felt the weight of the world pressing down? Each day a quiet battle just to keep your head above water? Every scraped knee, every unpaid bill, every dismissive glance from someone who thought they were better. It all added up, a silent testament to an unfair struggle. But then, there are moments so terrifying, so sudden, they make all the previous hardship seem like a distant whisper. A single breath held tight, a world narrowing to one horrifying point, where everything you cherished, everything you fought for, was on the brink of being ripped away. It's in that fire, that crucible of absolute fear, that you discover the strength you never knew lay dormant, the unyielding resolve of a mother pushed to the absolute limit, ready to face down any darkness that threatens her light. Stories like Maria's remind us that the human spirit is capable of extraordinary strength, especially when fighting for justice against overwhelming odds. If you believe in fighting for what's right, hit that like button and subscribe to join us for more powerful tales of courage and triumph. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the patch of worn grass, bathing the small park in a warm, golden light. Maria sat on a splintered wooden bench, the familiar scent of damp earth and honeysuckle thick in the air. Her hands, calloused from years of cleaning other people's messes, rested in her lap. It was an ordinary Tuesday, one much like any other. The rhythmic sound of distant traffic provided a constant hum beneath the innocent laughter of children playing. Maria watched her daughter, Lily, a bright spark in a faded pink dress, chasing a worn red ball near the edge of the park. Lily's joy was the simple, pure melody that underscored Maria's quiet life. They lived in a small, cramped apartment just 2 blocks away, a place where the paint peeled and the rent was a constant weight. But it was theirs. Maria worked double shifts most weeks, scrubbing floors and polishing windows until her back ached, often feeling invisible to the wealthy families whose homes she maintained. She was an underdog, yes, but she had Lily, and that was her entire world. Suddenly, the gentle rhythm of the afternoon shattered. The worn red ball bounced erratically and rolled towards the street bordering the park. Lily, her laughter still echoing, darted after it without a second thought. Maria's heart seized in her chest. Time seemed to stretch, every sound fading, except for the frantic pounding in her ears. She saw the blur of a car, faster than it should have been, on this quiet street, approaching the corner. The driver wasn't slowing. A primal scream tore from Maria's throat, raw and desperate. She scrambled off the bench, her legs propelling her forward as if she were flying. The ground a dizzying rush beneath her. The screech of tires ripped through the air, a sound that would forever be etched into her memory, sharp and terrifying. Her eyes were fixed on Lily, so small, so vulnerable, frozen for just a split second in the path of danger. A wave of cold, sickening dread washed over Maria, a taste like metal filling her mouth. This wasn't just an ordinary day anymore. It was a nightmare unfolding in agonizing slow motion. The world tilted on its axis, and in that horrifying instant, the life Maria had fought so hard to build threatened to crumble before her eyes. The shock held her captive for a fraction of a second, followed by a surge of adrenaline so powerful it made her vision swim. All she could think was her daughter, the impending impact, the impossibility of reaching her in time. The air crackled with a tension thick and suffocating, like the scent of ozone before a storm. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a trapped bird beating its wings against bone. Every cell in her body screamed at her to freeze, to shrink away, to become invisible against the harsh reality unfolding before her eyes. The cold dread that had begun as a trickle now flooded her limbs, making them feel heavy and unresponsive. Fear, primal and sharp, casted like copper on her tongue. It whispered insidious lies, telling her she was small, she was weak, she was utterly alone against the towering wave of hostility crashing down. Her breath hitched in her throat, a ragged, painful gasp that she barely suppressed. She could feel the heat radiating from the sneering faces around her, the palpable wave of disdain and cruelty washing over her like a physical blow. Their words, laced with venom, still echoed in her ears, sharp edges slicing at her resolve. She saw the glint in their eyes, the cruel amusement at her visible distress, and for a terrifying moment, the urge to simply crumble, to surrender to the humiliation, was overwhelming. It would be easier, wouldn't it? Just to accept defeat, to let the tide carry her under. But then, something deep within her shifted. A flicker, then a spark, igniting in the core of her being. It was the ember of pride, of defiance, of an innate refusal to be broken. A split second, no more, is all it took for that spark to become a flame, chasing away the paralyzing cold. She saw not just the danger, but the blatant injustice of it, the sheer wrongness of being targeted, of being diminished for daring to exist. Her fear didn't vanish entirely. It was still a tremor beneath the surface, but it was suddenly eclipsed by a fierce, hot surge of something else: courage. The absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Her mind, previously clouded by panic, cleared with astonishing speed. It was a sudden, sharp focus, narrowing down the impossible odds into a single, necessary action. She had to stand. She had to speak. She had to fight back, not just for herself, but for the principle being trampled underfoot. Her muscles tensed, not with the urge to flee, but with a burgeoning strength she hadn't known she possessed. Her chin lifted almost imperceptibly. Her eyes, though wide with apprehension, met the hostile gazes directed at her. The overwhelming odds were still there, a mountain looming before her. But now, instead of despair, she felt a desperate, burgeoning resolve. She would take the first step up that mountain. She would act. The air clawed at her lungs, thick with the acrid bite of smoke. Each breath was a victory, a ragged gasp pulled from the suffocating darkness that pressed in on all sides. Heat shimmered in the air, a tangible force that singed her exposed skin and turned the meager light from her phone into a weak, trembling beacon against the consuming blackness. The groaning of tortured metal and cracking timber echoed around her, a symphony of destruction that played a terrifying counterpoint to the frantic pounding of her own heart. She moved through the ruin, a ghost in the inferno, driven by a fierce, unrelenting purpose. Debris littered the floor, treacherous obstacles that tripped her weary feet and sent splinters biting into her palms as she scrambled for purchase. A section of ceiling groaned overhead, and she flinched, instinct screaming at her to retreat, to flee this collapsing tomb. But the faint sound, almost swallowed by the roar of the fire, kept her moving. A distant cry, a desperate plea for help that was the only signal guiding her through the chaos. Every muscle screamed in protest. Her legs burned with the effort of climbing over fallen beams. Her arms ached from pushing aside charred obstacles. Sweat poured from her brow, stinging her eyes, mingling with the grime and soot that painted her face in streaks of gray and black. The heat was unbearable now, radiating from invisible sources, baking the air and threatening to steal the last remnants of her strength. It wasn't just the physical toll, the sheer weight of the danger, The knowledge that one wrong step, one sudden collapse, could end everything, pressed down on her spirit. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, tightening with every step deeper into the inferno. Yet somehow, her resolve burned brighter than the flames. She imagined the terror in the voice she'd heard, the helplessness, and it fueled her forward, turning fear into a desperate courage. A section of wall gave way nearby with a deafening crash, sending a shower of burning embers raining down. She shielded her face, a sharp cry escaping her lips as a few found purchase on her arm. Pain flared, a searing agony, but there was no time to tend to it. The path ahead was blocked by a tangle of wires and twisted metal. Gritting her teeth, she threw her weight against a bent support beam, the rough, hot surface biting into her hands. It resisted, then groaned, shifting infinitesimally. She pushed again, every ounce of her remaining energy channeled into the effort, the scent of burning plastic assaulting her nostrils. The air grew hotter, thinner. The risks multiplied with every passing second. Each breath, potentially her last. Yet she could hear the faint sound again, closer now, a fragile thread of life pulling her onward through the suffocating, dangerous void. The tiny form, wrapped in a blanket provided by a kind stranger, was finally pressed into the trembling arms of a woman whose face was etched with hours of terror. A collective sigh, thick with relief, rippled through the crowd that had gathered. Tears streamed down the parents' faces, hot and heavy, soaking into the rough wool of the blanket and the soft hair of their child. They murmured words of gratitude, choked with emotion, clinging to the precious weight as if fearing it might vanish again. The air, moments ago tight with dread and desperation, now hummed with the fragile melody of safety returned. Bystanders crowded closer, their faces reflecting a mixture of awe and tearful joy. Hands reached out, offering pats on the back, murmuring congratulations, offering water bottles and tissues. The smell of damp earth and human anxiety began to dissipate, replaced by the sweet, almost cloying scent of released tension. For a few precious minutes, a bubble of shared humanity encased the scene, a testament to the powerful pull of collective hope. But the bubble was fragile. Like a chill draft slipping through a crack in the door, a different feeling began to seep into the edges of the crowd. Eyes, previously focused on the reunited family, began to drift towards the figure who had made it possible. Murmurs shifted, losing their timbre of shared relief, becoming lower, more questioning. A woman, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, met the protagonist's gaze, holding it a moment too long. A man nearby shifted his weight, his smile fading, replaced by a look of wary assessment. Questions, seemingly innocent at first, began to surface, delivered with a hesitant tone that belied their underlying suspicion. Who are you?" someone finally voiced, the words cutting through the lingering sounds of weeping relief. We didn't see you around here before." The protagonist offered a simple, weary response, but the words seemed to hang in the air, insufficient to quell the dawning unease. Another voice, sharper this time, spoke up. "How did you even know? It was so dark. How did you manage that?" The questions weren't about the rescue itself anymore. Not truly. They were probes, seeking something unknown, something perhaps unsettling. A palpable shift occurred in the atmosphere. The warmth generated by shared triumph began to cool, replaced by a subtle, creeping suspicion. Looks turned wary, then openly distrustful. The easy camaraderie of moments before dissolved, leaving behind fractured groups of people, whispering amongst themselves, their glances darting towards the protagonist. It was more than just curiosity. It was the first tendrils of something darker, something judging, something that saw difference and immediately assigned it malice or deceit. The relief was real, yes, but it was quickly being overshadowed by the first unsettling shadows of prejudice beginning to mask itself behind uncomfortable questions and suspicious eyes. The safety of the child was secured, but for the rescuer, a new, different kind of danger was just beginning to emerge from the crowd. The air, thick with unspoken judgment moments before, seemed to vibrate with sudden, sharp hostility. What began as curious stares and hushed murmurs now coalesced into direct confrontation. Aisha, still reeling from the unsettling feeling that she was being watched, found herself cornered near the entrance by two figures in official-looking uniforms. Event security, perhaps, or building managers. The subtle discomfort she'd felt earlier evaporated, replaced by the cold dread that pooled in her stomach. One of them, a burly man with a stern face, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. The other, a woman with tightly pursed lips, stood slightly behind him, her gaze raking over Aisha's simple, clean clothes, as if they were rags. It wasn't just suspicion in their eyes. It was accusation, raw and unfiltered, seemingly triggered the moment they saw her face. The sterile smell of the polished floor suddenly felt clinical, like the scent of a doctor's office, delivering bad news.
Excuse me, we need to ask you a few questions.
His voice wasn't a request. It was a demand, flat and devoid of courtesy. Aisha's heart hammered against her ribs. She tried to project calm, to appear confident, despite the sudden onslaught of fear and confusion.
Okay, how can I help you?
The man scoffed, a short, sharp sound that cut through the low hum of the building.
How can you help us? We want to know why you're really here. This event is for registered attendees, people who belong. Do you belong?
The last sentence was laced with an unmistakable emphasis, heavy with insinuation. His eyes didn't just question her presence, they questioned her right to exist in that space. The woman stepped closer, her voice dripping with condescension.
Yes, belong. What are you up to? Loitering? Looking for opportunities?
Her gaze swept dismissively from Aisha's head to her feet, lingering on her worn sneakers. The touch of the cool metal railing behind Aisha felt grounding, the only solid thing in a world that was suddenly tilting. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, not from shame, but from a simmering, indignant anger. It wasn't about a ticket or a registration or her purpose. It was about the color of her skin. The questions weren't inquiries. They were thinly veiled accusations, delivered with a chilling lack of humanity. This was the true face of prejudice, stripped bare of its disguise, staring her down in the harsh fluorescent light. The conflict was no longer subtle. It was a wall built before her, designed to block her path solely based on who she was. She was the underdog, and the gatekeepers of this world were making it clear she was not welcome. The adrenaline was still coursing through her veins, a frantic energy that had propelled her through the chaos moments before. She had pulled the child from the path of the skidding car, the screech of tires and panicked cries echoing in her ears even now. Relief washed over her, potent and sweet, like cool water on a parched tongue. She expected thanks, perhaps a tearful embrace from the mother whose child she had saved, a moment of shared humanity in the face of near tragedy. But the moment never arrived. Instead, as the crowd gathered, their eyes weren't filled with gratitude, but with something chillingly familiar: suspicion. A murmur rippled through the onlookers, low and unsettling. A woman, clutching a purse tightly, pointed a trembling finger not at the reckless driver, but at her. The sweet taste of relief curdled into a bitter, metallic tang of disbelief. Confusion clouded her mind, thick and disorienting like a sudden fog. Hadn't she just saved a life? Hadn't she risked her own safety?
Wait a minute. What was she doing so close to the street just then? It almost looked calculated.
The words, sharp and cold, cut through the air. They landed like stones in her chest, stealing her breath. Calculated? The accusation hung heavy, suffocating. Her heart pounded, not from the recent danger, but from a fresh wave of shock and hurt. Her act of selfless courage, born purely of instinct and compassion, was being twisted, examined through the lens of prejudice. The faces around her shifted, kindness replaced by doubt, admiration by wary glances. The warmth of the setting sun felt suddenly cold on her skin.
Yeah, funny how she was right there. You gotta wonder, don't you?
A man chimed in, his voice low and insidious. The betrayal was a physical blow, a searing pain that left her reeling. She had reached out her hand to help, and in return, hands were pointing back, accusing. Her heroism, the purest thing she possessed in that moment, was being weaponized against her because of the color of her skin. The air grew thick with unspoken bias, a suffocating blanket that extinguished the light of her good deed. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate refusal to see her humanity, her courage, her worth. The mother, previously tearful with fear for her child, now looked at her with a flicker of that same ugly suspicion. The sight twisted something deep inside her. It wasn't just the crowd. It was the very people she had helped who were doubting her, questioning her motives simply because she was black. The external conflict, the injustice she faced daily, now fused with a deep, painful internal struggle. If saving a life wasn't enough to be seen as good, what possibly could be? The weight of it all pressed down, heavy and suffocating, escalating the crisis within her soul and solidifying her resolve against the pervasive darkness of prejudice. The air in the small room felt thick and sterile, smelling faintly of old paper and industrial cleaner. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare that made the metal desk gleam coldly. She sat on a hard, unforgiving chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the cool plastic biting into her palms. Across the desk sat a man and a woman, faces impassive, pencils poised over notebooks. This was it, the formal gateway to justice she had believed in. The system that was supposed to right wrongs. But as the questions began, a chilling realization settled over her. The man leaned forward, his voice smooth, but carrying an undertone that felt like doubt.
Can you walk us through your actions leading up to the incident? Specifically, anything you might have done or said that could have escalated the situation?
Her stomach twisted. Her actions, not theirs. She felt a tremor run through her, a cold wave washing over her hope.
I was just trying to do my job. I didn't provoke anything.
The woman jotted something down, her expression unreadable.
But witnesses state there was a verbal exchange. Were you perhaps loud or confrontational?
The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. It wasn't just asking what happened. It was suggesting she was the architect of her own distress. The sterile room suddenly felt like a cage. The sound of their pens scratching was loud in the silence, punctuating the distance between their perspective and her reality. Every word felt like a judgment, a subtle accusation masked as inquiry. She tried again, her voice trembling slightly, despite her efforts to steady it.
I explained the situation calmly. It was their reaction that was aggressive, threatening.
The man sighed, a quiet, dismissive sound that felt like a physical blow.
Threatening is a strong word. People often feel threatened when they're simply being challenged on company policy. Are you sure you weren't mistaken about their intentions?
Her breath hitched. Mistaken? They were twisting her words, reframing her experience through a lens of suspicion and bias. It wasn't a process of seeking truth. It was an exercise in finding fault with her. The weight of the institution bore down, vast and impersonal, turning her into the problem, the agitator. The hope she'd clung to, the belief that the system would see the clear injustice, began to crumble like dust in her hands. She was not being heard. She was being interrogated, her reality dissected and doubted by those sworn to protect it. The isolation was profound, a deep ache that resonated in her bones. The formal face of justice had just shown her its true, prejudiced reflection. A chilling awareness settled upon her like a sudden drop in temperature. It started subtly, the briefest flicker of eyes looking away as she passed, the sudden hush in conversations that seemed to instantly resume in a low murmur once she was out of earshot. The air around her felt thick with unspoken judgment, heavy and suffocating. Every casual glance felt like scrutiny, every benign interaction tinged with suspicion. She began to feel perpetually watched, as though an invisible spotlight followed her movements through the town, highlighting her every action for silent, hostile review. She walked with a new self-consciousness, acutely aware of the space she occupied. The familiar streets felt alien. The warm brick of the old buildings seemed to glare down at her. The scent of baking bread from the corner bakery now carried a hint of bitterness. It wasn't just paranoia. It was a tangible shift in the community's energy towards her. The pleasant nods she once received were replaced by averted gazes or tight, disapproving expressions. Then came the whispers, low, insidious murmurs that clung to the edges of her hearing like static. They were distorted fragments, twisting the simple truth of her actions into something ugly and suspicious. A visit to the post office became a secret meeting. A friendly chat with an old acquaintance was spun into a scheme. These whispers were laced with an undercurrent she recognized, a familiar, venomous thread of prejudice. Her resilience, her determination to stand tall, was being reframed as aggression, her attempts to clarify misunderstandings painted as deceit. The narrative being woven was insidious, fueled by the very bias she was confronting, turning her into the villain in a story where she was the one seeking justice. Sometimes, the whispers coalesced into something clearer, cutting through the noise like broken glass. She overheard snippets in the grocery store aisle, felt the sting of them in the park.
She thinks she's better than us, causes trouble everywhere she goes.
Came from behind a stack of canned goods, sharp and clear, before dissolving back into mumbles. Another time, near the town's square fountain, a group parted as she approached, and she caught a pointed comment, loud enough to be intended for her ears.
Always looking for a handout, trying to stir things up where she doesn't belong.
The outright accusations were less frequent but infinitely more jarring. A neighbor she'd known for years suddenly frosty, implying she was untrustworthy. A shopkeeper who had always greeted her warmly now treating her with cool formality, hinting darkly about certain types of people bringing discord. Each instance chipped away at her sense of belonging, reinforcing her status as an outsider, not because of anything she had done, but because of who she was in their prejudiced eyes. The unfairness tasted like bile in the back of her throat, a constant, sickening reminder that the truth mattered little when viewed through a lens of hate. The escalation was complete. The conflict had moved from the public arena into the very air she breathed, saturating the community with suspicion. A crushing weight settled upon her shoulders, heavier than any physical burden. Each day felt like navigating a thick, suffocating fog, the air stale with unspoken judgment and thinly veiled contempt. The vibrant hues of her world had bled into a dull, oppressive gray, matching the leaden feeling in her gut. She tasted only bitterness, a constant reminder of the unfairness that clung to her like a second skin. The relentless chipping away at her spirit had finally brought her to her knees, not physically, but deep within the core of her being. The echoes of malicious whispers and dismissive laughter seemed to follow her everywhere, even in the quiet corners of her own mind. They were soundtracks to her failure, confirming the narrative the prejudice sought to build, that she was less than, unworthy, and deserving of every slight. She remembered the fire that had burned within her, the righteous anger that had fueled her initial stand against the injustice. It felt like a lifetime ago. Now, the embers were cold, replaced by an aching hollowness. Had it been worth it? The question gnawed at her, a relentless parasite feeding on her dwindling hope. Every time she had spoken up, every time she had challenged the casual cruelty or blatant discrimination, the pushback had intensified. It wasn't just resistance. It was a coordinated effort to break her, to make her regret ever daring to demand equality. The sheer exhaustion of constantly fighting, constantly being scrutinized, constantly being undermined, was overwhelming. It felt like being trapped in a storm that never passed, beaten down by rain and wind until she could no longer lift her head. She looked at the faces around her, some indifferent, some openly hostile, a few perhaps sympathetic but unwilling to act, and felt a profound sense of isolation. The prejudice wasn't just directed at her. It was a system, a pervasive atmosphere that seemed unbreakable. How could one person possibly stand against such an ingrained, powerful force? Despair was a physical sensation now, a tightening in her chest, a weakness in her limbs. The unfairness wasn't just an external problem. It had seeped into her, threatening to extinguish the last flicker of her resilience. This was the deepest point of the struggle, the moment where the mountain seemed unclimbable, and the valley of hopelessness stretched endlessly before her. Was there truly any point in going on? The thought was a chilling whisper in the silence of her mind. The air hung thick and heavy, tasting of stale coffee and the metallic tang of fear that had become her constant companion. Each breath felt like inhaling dust, scraping against lungs weary from fighting a battle that seemed impossible to win. Maria slumped in the cheap, uncomfortable chair, the fluorescent lights of the nearly empty office humming a mournful tune above her head. The weight of the day, of the endless accusations and subtle sabotage, pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. She could still hear the echo of their dismissive laughter, feel the cold sting of their indifference. Despair was a deep well, and she felt herself sinking deeper into its suffocating darkness. Her eyes burned, not just from exhaustion, but from the unshed tears that constantly threatened to spill. She pushed herself up, the joints in her knees protesting, and walked slowly towards the exit, the linoleum floor cool beneath her worn shoes. The office was a labyrinth of cubicles, silent witnesses to her ongoing torment. As she reached the outer door, her hand outstretched for the handle, her gaze fell upon something unexpected. Tucked into the small gap between the door and the frame was a simple, unmarked envelope. It wasn't thick or official-looking, just a standard business envelope, clean and anonymous. A strange jolt ran through her, a ripple in the stagnant pool of her misery. It didn't make sense. Who would leave something here, like this, at this hour? Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked it up. It felt light, containing perhaps only a single sheet of paper. There was no name, no address, no return label. Just an envelope. A faint, almost imperceptible scent of old paper and something else, something she couldn't place, wafted from it. Curiosity, a feeling long buried under layers of dread, stirred within her. This was different. This wasn't another harsh word, another barrier erected in her path. It was an anomaly. Hesitantly, she slid a finger under the flap and carefully opened it. Inside, there was indeed just one sheet of paper. It wasn't typed. The writing was a neat, formal script, anonymous, yet somehow deliberate. It contained only 3 lines. A date from the past, a seemingly random series of numbers and letters, and a single word that made her pause, her brow furrowed in confusion. A department name she barely recognized within the company structure, one far removed from her own world. That was all. No context, no explanation, no signature. Nothing that immediately offered solace or understanding. She stared at the paper, turning it over in her hand. It meant nothing to her, yet it felt undeniably significant. It was a tiny, misplaced puzzle piece in a landscape of chaos. Why this? Why now? It didn't solve her problems. The weight of her conflict remained. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, her mind wasn't solely consumed by the immediate struggle. It was grappling with a strange external mystery. The despair didn't vanish, but its suffocating grip loosened, just enough to allow a sliver of something else to enter. Not hope, not yet, but perhaps intrigue. A tiny, fragile seed of possibility had been planted in the barren soil of her fear. The brief reprieve, the fragile hint of understanding that had flickered just hours before, was swiftly extinguished. It was a cruel trick of fate, a lifting of the storm clouds, only for a darker, more furious tempest to gather on the horizon. A formal summons arrived. Stark white paper against a dark background, alleging misconduct, insubordination, and even fabrications. The words felt like physical blows, each syllable a hammer striking against the fragile hope she had dared to nurture. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a full-blown assault on her character, her integrity, her very future. The meeting room was cold, the air thick with unspoken tension and the faint metallic smell of fear. Harsh fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting long, unforgiving shadows that seemed to distort faces, making even neutral expressions appear menacing. She sat across a polished table that felt vast and empty, facing not just her accusers, but a panel of administrators, their faces largely unreadable, their postures stiff and formal. Every eye felt like a spotlight exposing her vulnerability. Her palms were slick with sweat, her heart a frantic bird trapped in her chest. The accusations began, delivered with a chilling calm that spoke of careful preparation. The female bully, poised and seemingly sincere, detailed a narrative twisted beyond recognition, painting the victim as erratic, untrustworthy, and disruptive.
And after repeated attempts to guide her, Her behavior only became more defiant. It's a pattern of deliberate obstruction.
Then the male bully added his weight, his voice dripping with feigned disappointment and authority he hadn't earned.
We had such high hopes, truly, but the level of invention in her claims, it forces our hand. It creates an untenable situation for everyone.
They presented selective emails, out-of-context comments, and outright lies dressed up as concern. The underdog listened, her mind reeling, trying to grasp the sheer audacity of their fabrication. When it was her turn to speak, her voice, despite her best efforts, trembled.
None of that is true. You're twisting everything. I provided evidence. I showed you the discrepancies. This is retaliation.
But her words seemed to dissipate in the sterile air, lacking the calculated weight of their performance. The panel members exchanged glances, their expressions confirming her worst fears. They hadn't come to listen. They had come to rubber stamp a predetermined outcome. The lead administrator cleared his throat, the sound deafening in the silence that followed the victim's plea. His words were measured, devoid of emotion, utterly final. He spoke of upholding standards, of maintaining order, of difficult decisions made for the good of the collective. The decision was delivered like a death sentence, the formal accusation upheld, a severe reprimand issued, and conditions imposed that stripped away her responsibilities, effectively sidelining her, branding her as problematic. It was a public shaming disguised as due process. A gasp caught in her throat, tasting like bitter ash. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. This wasn't just unfair. It was a complete negation of reality. A victory for deceit over truth. She saw the brief, triumphant flicker in the eyes of her tormentors. A silent confirmation that they had won. Alone, exposed, and officially condemned, the underdog felt the crushing weight of absolute despair. Things in that moment truly looked their absolute worst. The screen flickered to life, its cool blue light sharp against the dim room. Elena slumped in her chair, the weight of the past weeks pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. The air in her small apartment felt stagnant, heavy with the scent of stale coffee and weary resignation. Another futile application sent, another door likely to remain closed. Her fingers, stiff with tension, moved mechanically across the mousepad. She scrolled through her inbox, a graveyard of ignored pleas and polite rejections, when a notification popped up, stark and unexpected. The sender's address caught her eye. Not a familiar colleague or recruiter, but an internal company address she'd only ever seen associated with the upper echelons. Names whispered with reverence and distance. Her heart gave a sudden violent lurch against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She stared at the subject line. Regarding your recent circumstances. It felt clinical, yet held an electric charge that jolted through her. Circumstances? Was someone above her immediate tormentors aware? Her breath hitched. The click of the mouse felt deafeningly loud in the sudden silence that enveloped her. The email opened. Stark white text on the screen. It was brief, concise. Signed with a name that sent a cold tremor of shock, mixed with disbelief down her spine. A name that belonged to an executive rarely seen below the 55th floor. A figure of almost legendary authority within the corporation. It wasn't a form letter. It addressed her directly, albeit cryptically. The words seemed to float off the screen, each one landing with the force of a small stone dropping into still water, sending ripples of intense feeling across her exhausted soul.
Miss Petrova, I am writing regarding the situation that has recently come to my attention concerning your employment within the company. I believe a direct conversation is necessary. Please reply to schedule a confidential meeting at your earliest convenience. Your discretion in this matter is of the utmost importance.
Her hands began to tremble uncontrollably, the mouse slipping in her suddenly clammy grip. The metallic taste of fear and something akin to desperate hope flooded her mouth. Discretion. Confidential meeting. A direct conversation with him? The man known for his sharp intellect and unwavering control? It felt unreal. A sudden, impossible crack in the suffocating wall that had been closing in around her. The sterile scent of the cleaning fluid she'd used earlier seemed sharper now, cutting through the air. A jarring note in the sudden, overwhelming tide of emotion. Could this be real? Had someone truly seen through the carefully constructed facade of dismissal and slander? The shock was profound, staggering, leaving her momentarily breathless. A powerful presence had noticed. The game, she realized with a jolt that left her muscles tight and aching, had just changed. The man who had orchestrated the swift, anonymous rescue was not merely a kind stranger. He was Mr. Sterling himself, the founder and CEO of the sprawling corporation where she had been a diligent, though overlooked, employee. His connection was profound. The crisis she had inadvertently averted had threatened his own family's safety, a fact she remained unaware of. But while he knew of her courage, the depth of the injustice she subsequently suffered remained hidden until now. The truth didn't arrive through whispered rumors or sympathetic colleagues. It came through the cold, unwavering lens of the company's extensive security camera system. A routine review of the incident's aftermath, standard procedure for assessing property damage and response times, captured something far more disturbing than shattered glass or dislodged ceiling tiles. It captured the raw, unedited reality of her betrayal. Sitting in the hushed silence of his executive security office, the sterile air conditioning doing little to cool the sudden heat of his anger, Mr. Sterling watched the playback. He saw her, weary but with a flicker of relief in her eyes, accepting praise she barely registered, her focus on the immediate chaos she had helped contain. Then the grainy footage shifted, showing her vulnerable moment away from the main crowd. He saw the calculated approach of the bullies, their faces sharp with malice in the harsh office light. He heard their voices, tinny through the audio feed, dripping with condescension and false accusation. The subtle, cruel movements as they fabricated evidence, the careful placement of objects to paint her as negligent, perhaps even complicit. His breath hitched as he watched her face fall, saw the confusion morph into crushing despair as she realized the trap closing around her. The sheer pettiness of it, the vile nature of tearing down someone who had just acted with such bravery, was a physical blow. The smell of stale coffee in the room suddenly seemed suffocating. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate, cruel act of sabotage. The twist. Previously, a horrifying possibility, whispered in hushed tones, was laid bare in irrefutable visual evidence. She hadn't failed. She had been framed. The footage ended, the screen flickering back to a static view of an empty corridor. Mr. Sterling remained seated, the tension in his shoulders palpable. He had seen her courage. Now he had seen their depravity. A profound sense of moral outrage settled deep within him, heavy and cold. The quiet click of the remote control was the only sound in the room as he rewound the footage, his resolve hardening with every replay. This injustice, happening within the walls of his own company, could not and would not stand. The time for quiet observation was over. The stage was undeniably set. The powerful engines of change roared to life, fueled by the quiet fury of a man who had seen enough. The millionaire, his face set with a steely resolve, didn't just offer words, he unleashed a torrent of resources and influence. Top legal minds, renowned for dismantling corporate deceit and systemic bias, were immediately retained. They swarmed the case, their sharp intellects dissecting every false accusation, every twisted piece of evidence, used to demonize the young woman who had simply done her duty. The scent of aged leather and expensive paper filled the conference rooms, where strategies were forged, a stark contrast to the stale, oppressive air she had breathed in the station house. But legal maneuvering was only the first wave. The millionaire understood the power of public perception, especially when battling entrenched prejudice. He didn't just issue press releases. He orchestrated a campaign to flood the airwaves and news feeds with the unvarnished truth. Press conferences were held, not in stuffy corporate offices, but in spaces that symbolized justice and community. He personally stood before the cameras, his voice calm but carrying immense weight, using his undeniable credibility to validate her actions, painting a vivid picture of the chaotic, life-threatening situation she had faced and the courage she had shown. He didn't shy away from naming the insidious force at play. He spoke plainly about the racism that had blinded some, fueling their baseless accusations and swift condemnation. His words cut through the noise, resonating with a chilling clarity that made many squirm. The harsh, judgmental glares that had followed her for weeks now felt distant, replaced by tentative glances of curiosity, then understanding, and finally, outrage directed elsewhere. The backlash against the architects of her suffering began with palpable force. Investigations were launched not just into the incident, but into the patterns of behavior that had enabled such injustice. Whistleblowers, emboldened by the public spotlight, began to step forward, whispering secrets that echoed through the halls of power like chilling winds. The comfortable edifice of lies and prejudice that had stood unchallenged for so long began to crumble under the relentless pressure of truth and influence. This wasn't just defense. This was a counter-offensive, a forceful reclaiming of her narrative, and a promise that the injustice visited upon her would not stand, leaving a bitter taste of consequence in the mouths of those who had sought to silence her. Justice was taking its stand, tall and unyielding. The air crackled with a different energy now. Not the thick, suffocating tension of doubt and accusation, but a nervous, anticipatory hum. The truth, meticulously gathered and presented with the undeniable backing of the millionaire, Mr. Sterling, had crashed upon the community like a tidal wave, washing away the carefully constructed lies. Proof, irrefutable and stark, laid bare the manipulation, the targeted cruelty, and the sheer injustice. Sarah felt it first as she walked through the marketplace she had once avoided like a plague. The furtive whispers were still there, but their tone had changed. They were not whispers of condemnation now, but of shock, regret, and dawning understanding. Eyes that had once glared with suspicion now darted away in shame or met hers with hesitant, almost apologetic glances. A woman who had publicly scorned her just weeks ago simply nodded, her face etched with discomfort. It felt like a physical weight lifting from Sarah's shoulders, a lightness spreading through her chest she hadn't felt in years. The taste of vindication was sweet and sharp, like unexpected rain on parched earth. Mr. Sterling's public statement, calm but firm, broadcast across local news channels and shared rapidly online, had been the final nail in the coffin of the false narrative. He hadn't just spoken. He had provided evidence, digital footprints, witness testimonies that his resources had helped uncover, financial records that contradicted the bully's claims. He stood not just as a wealthy patron, but as a voice of moral authority.
The truth, however inconvenient or painful, is a non-negotiable foundation for a just society. What has transpired here is a gross injustice, and it is imperative that this community acknowledges it and moves forward with integrity.
The shift was palpable. Social media, once a cesspool of condemnation, now overflowed with expressions of shock, sympathy, and outrage directed squarely at those who had spread the lies. Apologies, some genuine, some clearly for public consumption, began to trickle in. The scent of change was in the air, no longer thick with malice, but carrying the faint, hopeful fragrance of potential fairness. This wasn't the end, not by a long shot, but it was the clear, decisive turning point. The wheels of payback had begun to grind, powered by the revealed truth and the community's rapidly changing tide of opinion. For Sarah, it was more than just public validation. It was the reclamation of her dignity, the essential first step in her inevitable rise. The air in the room hummed with a quiet excitement, a palpable shift from the oppressive silence that had so often been her companion. Soft lamplight caught the rich sheen of the dress laid out on the bed, a gown of deep sapphire, the color of courage found after long nights of despair. Its fabric felt cool and luxurious beneath her fingertips, a stark contrast to the rough, threadbare isolation she had known not so long ago. This was not just clothing, it was armor, a symbol of the transformation that had occurred. Around her, faces smiled. Not the cruel, smirking masks she had faced in boardrooms and whispered corners, but genuine, supportive expressions. People she had inspired, allies who had emerged from the shadows of the conflict, offered quiet words of encouragement, adjusting a stray strand of hair, clasping her hand gently. She caught the faint, sweet scent of flowers delivered earlier, a delicate perfume overlaying the nervous energy in the room. Every sight, every sound, every touch felt like a blessing, a confirmation that the lonely fight was truly over. She looked at her reflection, a woman poised on the precipice of formal recognition. The woman in the glass was still her, yet profoundly changed. She remembered the hollow ache in her stomach, the constant knot of anxiety that had been her daily companion during the worst times. She remembered the dismissive waves of hands, the cold eyes that saw only an obstacle, an underdog, to be crushed. She remembered standing alone, the weight of injustice, a physical burden on her shoulders, the air thick with the unspoken contempt of those who thought her insignificant. Now the weight was gone, replaced by a lightness that felt almost unreal. The air was clear, filled not with malice, but with anticipation. She thought of the moments of sharp, cutting conflict, the desperate struggle to be heard, the sheer, unadulterated fear. It had consumed her, threatened to break her. But she hadn't broken. She had bent, yes, but she had found strength she never knew she possessed. This evening, this honor, was the world acknowledging that strength. It was the universe correcting itself, a dramatic pivot from the nadir of her despair to the zenith of her vindication. This formal event wasn't just a celebration, it was the physical manifestation of her rise. The payback wasn't revenge dealt in kind, but justice delivered on a grand scale. Her resilience publicly affirmed, her integrity finally seen. As she fastened the clasp of a simple necklace, her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming emotion of it all. The journey had been long, fraught with pain and doubt, but standing here now, surrounded by warmth and affirmation, the transition from conflict to this breathtaking celebration felt complete. Undeniable proof that even the smallest seed of courage, when nurtured through adversity, could blossom into an unstoppable force. She took a deep breath, the scent of possibility filling her lungs. She was ready. The air crackled with an energy unlike any she had felt before. It wasn't the suffocating tension of fear or the cold weight of despair. It was the vibrant hum of recognition, of collective breath held in anticipation. Before her stretched a sea of faces, illuminated by the midday sun filtering through towering windows, their expressions a mix of admiration and reverence. Banners celebrating courage and justice hung from the rafters. Splashes of defiant color against the solemn grandeur of the hall. The scent of polished wood and faint floral arrangements filled the space, a stark contrast to the stale, oppressive air of the places she had endured. A man, tall and commanding, stood at the podium, his voice amplified, resonating with authority and regret. He spoke of her unwavering spirit, her refusal to be broken in the face of relentless cruelty. He recounted the details of the injustice, the insidious prejudice that had sought to diminish her. His words a public acknowledgement of the darkness she had faced. Then, his voice shifted, hardening as he directly addressed the systemic failures and the individuals who had perpetrated the harm. The public denouncement was swift, unequivocal, a cleansing wave washing over the hushed crowd. Names were spoken, actions condemned, not just the overt acts, but the silent complicity, the turned backs, the hushed whispers that had fueled the torment. It felt like a heavy shroud lifting, revealing the ugliness beneath before tearing it apart. Then, it was her turn. She walked to the podium, her steps steady, her gaze sweeping across the faces. There was no tremor in her hands as she adjusted the microphone, no shadow of the fear that had once been her constant companion. She looked out, not at her tormentors, but at the countless others who had suffered in silence, at the young eyes looking for hope. Her voice, when she began, was clear and strong, carrying the weight of her journey, yet soaring with newfound freedom.
They tried to bury us. They tried to tell us our worth was less, our dreams were small, our very existence a problem. But they forgot one thing. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It is the decision to act in spite of it. Prejudice thrives in silence, in the shadows where we are afraid to speak its name. But justice, true justice, demands the light. It demands that we stand tall, that we lift each other up, that we refuse to let hate win.
Her words were a melody of resilience, echoing through the hall, touching every soul present. She spoke of the scars, not as marks of defeat, but as symbols of survival, of lessons learned in the hardest of schools. She spoke of the future, not as a distant dream, but as a world they had the power to build, brick by painstaking brick, on the foundation of equality and understanding. She ended with a simple yet profound call to action, to see one another fully, to listen with empathy, to fight for what is right, not just for oneself, but for everyone. A wave of applause, deafening and heartfelt, washed over her. A chorus of affirmation for the hero who had emerged from the ashes. As the ceremony concluded, the crowd slowly dispersed, their steps lighter, their conversations filled with the echoes of her message. She stood for a moment longer, the weight of the past now replaced by the promise of tomorrow. The journey had been long, fraught with pain and uncertainty, a relentless uphill battle against an unseen current. But she had reached the summit, not just for herself, but for all who had dared to dream of a fairer world. The road ahead would undoubtedly hold new challenges, new moments requiring courage and conviction. But now, she walked with a different kind of strength, the kind forged in fire and tempered by justice. The fight wasn't over, not truly, not while prejudice still lingered in the corners of the world. But the battle had been won, and her legacy, not of victimhood, but of triumphant resilience and moral fortitude, was etched into the heart of their community, a beacon for generations to come. It was a quiet, profound victory, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome, to heal, and to inspire. The air outside felt crisp, clean, filled with the scent of possibility.